Yes, as promised, David Roberts is back. Dude, I am loving your podcast. If people listen to this podcast and they don't listen to your podcast, I think they're bad people. I think they're scoundrels.
Yeah, I'm judging them right now.
Good, as you should. It's really great. You've gotten really good at it, and I love the guests that you have. Obviously, the subjects and the way that you're conducting interviews. So I want to ask you, just jump on a bunch of your recent episodes, but I wanted to start by asking you specifically about kind of where certain industries are, if you will. But you had this great conversation with Mary Powell, who's the CEO of Sunrun, which I guess is like one of the biggest solar provider in America.
Biggest rooftop solar, residential solar provider.
So we're talking about residential solar, and to tie it into your trip to Australia, they do 1 out of 3 houses. We do a 1 out of 25 houses. We have plenty of sun in America. Start with explaining where that industry is at and why we are so behind other places.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, solar panels themselves, the cells themselves are very much commoditized. It's very much a global market. So we're buying the same cheap solar panels that they're buying in Australia. So it's not that. It's not the hardware, right? It's all the what are called soft costs, which means finding an installer, calling, getting a permit, getting the initial permit, getting the initial inspection, getting the initial permit, all that stuff, basically. And Australia has just spent a lot of time making all of that stuff super easy. So you can basically call, have somebody on your rooftop within an hour, have, an installed system in a week. Like it's super, super smooth. And anyone who's gotten rooftop solar in the US will tell you it's like a hassle. It's a hassle even under almost the best of circumstances. And that's partly industry. It's partly, a lot of it is regulatory. A lot of it is our horrible utilities, which don't necessarily want to make it easy. Like there's a bunch of explanations, but it's all the non-hardware parts of it, basically. Bureaucracy.
Yeah, bureaucracy. But you actually have a whole, I think it was a post or a pod about wanting more bureaucracy.
Well, I do love government capacity. This is bureaucracy in the negative sense of
right.
Unnecessary barriers.
So some of those barriers, you mentioned utilities. You beat this drum a lot in your work. And I think they have gotten a big pass by a lot of folks, journalists, activists, obviously, because they're more obscure than the fossil fuel industry. But everybody knows that they're paying a utility company. It's not like we don't know they exist. But I think the issue is that there are so many different agencies and companies, the public-private partnerships. Most of us don't understand how they work, who they are, who's making money, how they're making money. But they seem to be one of the biggest problems in, the world, but certainly the U.S. for progress here.
Yeah, I once said when I sat down to write a series on utilities back in I want to say 2013 or something like that, 10 years ago, I introduced the whole thing by saying that utilities are protected by a force field of tedium. And that line has really stuck. People quote that back at me all the time. And it's true. You dig in a little bit and it's like you're in a swamp of acronyms and agencies. And, it's just really, so it's very difficult to pull a clear sort of good guy, bad guy fight out of that. It's very difficult to clarify the stakes. But I mean, the main thing to know, and I've repeated this a million times, but people still need to hear it, is just that the way we set utilities up, the way we establish them, they're monopolies. They get a monopoly over a territory, and in exchange, they're supposed to keep rates reasonable and low and provide good service. But the way they make a profit is not on selling electricity, right? You can't allow a monopoly to make money on the thing it has a monopoly on, because then it can just crank up prices forever, right? There's by definition, there's no competition. So it can't make money. We can't allow them to make money on electricity. So how do we draw private capital into utilities? We do it by offering them a rate of return on their investments in building stuff. So if they invest in, big power poles or transformers or whatever, they get like a 9 or 10%, depending on the utility and the regulatory body, 9% guaranteed rate of return on that investment. That's how they make money. So that made a ton of sense when we needed to electrify the country, right? When people didn't have electricity and we needed to draw capital in and build out electricity to the country.
It was a good incentive 100 years ago.
Yes, 100 years ago. But now it's built out. And now we need to do a lot of things that are kind of the opposite of building. They're economizing, they're building less, like energy efficiency. If you do energy efficiency well, you need to build less, right? If you do distributed energy like rooftop solar well, and people are generating their own power, that means you need less utility infrastructure. And all of that is good for society, but directly against utilities' interests, right? They want to build more stuff. So anything that has them building less stuff is inherently against their financial interests. And that basic clash is at the root of so many, obscure energy problems. If you pull the string far enough, you come back to utilities basically not wanting to do it. So they have to be forced and cajoled and bribed. And they'll only do as much of it as you bribe them to do. And they will use your rate money that you're paying them to lobby lawmakers against those things that would be very much to your benefit, right? But not to theirs. So it's a perverse situation.
State legislatures have passed laws that they're not allowed to use?
A couple of states have passed it. I hope that spreads. I think that's actually like a trend. I think that's spreading because it is outrageous when you think about it, that they're allowed to use your money to lobby against your interests more or less.
Remember the healthcare fight when small part of comprehensive healthcare reform was you cannot use the premiums on I'm paying for my health insurance and healthcare on, I think it was advertisement.
Yeah.
Right. It's like these contradicting ideas, although that was, more privatized generally when it comes to health insurance. Talk to me about your episode about what's going on in Maine. It seems like of all the things that we could be talking about 2 weeks before Election Day, that might be the most important, imminent one. What's on the ballot?
Really interesting case. So Maine has 2 big utilities right now that are very unpopular. They provide pretty low quality service. They have some of the most complaints of any private investor-owned utilities in the country. They have more frequent blackouts, lower quality service. They are standing in the way of rooftop solar, really jacking up sort of fees and stuff on rooftop solar, slowing those things down. So the people of Maine are upset, and what they want to do is, and this is a referendum on the November ballot, is replace those 2 private utilities with a single public utility, a single main utility called Pine Tree Power that would be governed by a sort of quasi-elected board of people in Maine and operated on a nonprofit basis. So instead of whatever 9 to 10% being siphoned off for profit, it all goes back into investing in better service and more decarbonization for Mainers. Is that what they're called? Mainers?
I think they're called Mainers, but the way you're describing it, it seems like that would be in the public's interest. What are we missing? It's not that simple.
Well, it's nothing in the electricity world, nothing in the utility world is ever that simple. I mean, among other things, Maine would have to buy the assets from those utilities, and that's billions of dollars. So that would have to be financed over a period of years and paid back. And then there's figuring out the board, there's figuring out how to pass things over. So the opposition is basically saying, look, we have a board of regulators that control these 2 private utilities you don't like. If we just stiffened the spine of those regulators, we could force the private utilities to do the things you want the public utility to do a lot faster and a lot more simply than this, which will take years and involve us in uncertainty and bureaucracy for years trying to figure it out. So it's a pragmatic argument against it, basically. Just it's more trouble than it's worth. So we'll see. I mean, obviously the utilities are outspending their opponents in that race by like
I can only imagine the ads.
It's I mean, they're swamping their opponents with money. So, if you're cynical, the utilities will probably win that one just because of sheer financial advantage. But it's certainly interesting to see how the public's processing it.
Everybody is using the same grid nonetheless. Well, that's not the right way to saying it, but everybody is on the grid. All the utilities, all the homeowners, every resident, we all depend on a grid. You talk a lot about that grid. You get granular on it, which is why I love listening to you. You talk to all the best experts on it. How do I talk with listeners? How do we talk about it with people who don't quite understand what we mean by the grid? And because we've got to talk about the fact that it's really old and it's really hard to change it, obviously, but there are some things that you could do to adapt it right now to make it far more efficient. And of course, there are plenty of obstacles on the way. But how do we talk about it? How do you talk about it best for people?
Well, I think my entree, usually the way I introduce the idea is to say that we need to decarbonize, right? People understand that more or less. We need to get rid of carbon, and the best way we know to do that today is to electrify things, to take things that aren't running on electricity and move them over to electricity, like cars, for instance. That's the example that everybody understands. We need to take all the cars that are now running on gasoline, move them over so they're running on clean electricity.
Right.
That's how we're going to get to zero carbon, is clean up the electricity, right, by shifting over to wind and solar and geothermal and et cetera, and then get everything hooked up to that electricity. Make sure that everything that uses energy that is generated on the grid. And so if that's true, if we're going to move right now, I think it's 20-30% of our total energy use comes from electricity. We're talking about taking that 20 or 30 to 90, 95, 100, which means we're going to need a lot more electricity, a lot more, like 2x, maybe 3x as much, which means the delivery vehicle for that electricity, which is the grid, all those wires you see overhead, is going to be expected to do much, much, much more. It's going to be expected to decarbonize our entire economy, and it's going to be expected to basically run our entire economy. Our entire economy is going to be sustained by that grid in a way that's much more fundamental than is true today. So if nothing else, we all need to start thinking a lot more about the grid and paying more attention to it. It's sort of, it's been sort of working away in the background for years and has not really been a subject of public conversation. But now, like, we need to grow it quickly, and we need to make it more resilient and effective quickly. We need to we need to turn our attention in that way. And so, as you say, it's difficult to build more of it, although we have to. There's no way around the fact that we have to build a lot more transmission lines, long distance transmission lines, just to ease the burden and share the burden more widely and bring the renewables from where they are to where they're needed. They're often located remotely, and you have to bring that power to the load centers. So we need a lot more transmission lines, but they're very difficult to build. So in the meantime, what you're referring to are a set of technologies that can help us get more out of the current grid. And so we just need to be banging the drum for these things so regulators prioritize them more or less.
I mean, I pay pretty close attention to this stuff and your writing and your podcast, but hearing a whole episode about how to get more out of the grid and talking to this person this woman might have been one of the smartest people I've ever heard, talking about GETS, which is an acronym.
Grid enhancing technologies. Yes.
Grid enhancing technologies, and the fact that there are a lot of solutions and then obstacles, the lack of transmission infrastructure and the capacity versus the congestion. And we need, as you just said, more and more. And yet I can't explain it well. The load times when everybody wants it, it creates congestion, and we need to just be able to adapt. But you did this whole episode where it's not necessarily that we have to build and rebuild, but right now there are things we could do to adapt the current ancient infrastructure to make there be less congestion and more adaptability.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of general point I make is that I think, most people don't think a lot about the grid at all. And insofar as they do, I think the analogy in their head is kind of like the internet, like it's all digitized and high tech and whatever. And I think people would be surprised at how much of this electricity infrastructure is still very physical. Like utilities find out about power outages by people calling them on the phone, and they reroute power by pulling, by like Bob, who's like been working there for 30 years, sort of like eyeballing and pulling switches, like it's way more low tech than people think it is. And so consequently, it's kind of crude and not very fully utilized. So like for a given transmission line, right, how much power can you put through it? That depends on the weather, how cold it is, how much the wind is blowing, how close the trees are, all that stuff. But we don't know for a given transmission line all that stuff because we can't go out and monitor every single one of them. So we're just guessing. We make these estimations and we push the amount of power through it that is well below our estimation of its capacity, just to be super careful. But the thing is, we're wasting a bunch of capacity by doing that. So what we have now are all these ways to go out and hang these digital devices on the lines that can monitor air pressure and the wind and how cold it is and how much the line is sagging or how close the trees are getting. So you can know much more precisely what the actual real-time capacity of that line is, and you can push much more power through it. You can get the power much closer to the actual capacity. And just by doing that, just by real-time monitoring of the lines rather than estimations, you can get like 30 to 40% more power through that line just by knowing better on a minute-to-minute basis what the conditions are around that line. And that's enabled by cheap digital sensing and cheap digital communications, like all this stuff we have now, these tiny little drones and little machines and cameras and sensors, like all that stuff is getting very cheap. So at the very least, we should do that to all the big transmission lines, right? Like that's like 30% more capacity, low-hanging fruit, just sitting there waiting for us to pluck it, right? So there's lots of stuff like that where you could improve the performance of the existing grid with technology we have now.
Sounds like an opportunity for capitalists, but they're not maybe taking advantage of. Which would be surprising.
Capitalism and the utility sector are only faintly related.
Why is that? Can you explain why
it's monopolies, right? I mean, yeah. That's it. There's no competition. Like if you're the transmission regulator for a given area, you run the transmission lines. You don't have a competing set of transmission lines that's like trying to outperform you, that you're like, under pressure from. The only pressure you feel at all is from regulators, and very often you're very cozy with those regulators. Right. You know them, and you've been donating to their campaigns. So there's just not a lot of like market discipline involved in these areas. Although there have been attempts in the past few decades to introduce more, but it's still pretty like sleepy backwater in terms of market dynamics.
So much more to say about the grid enhancing technologies and that woman that you talked to. I got to look this up. I want to keep calling her that woman.
Julia.
So brilliant. Julia Selker, her name. She was really fascinating. Great. She's an activist.
She's great. Well, she's the head of this basically advocacy organization that's trying to push these grid enhancing technologies, just sort of banging the drum, trying to raise awareness of them.
Let's go to batteries. I feel like you write and understand as much about battery technology as any journalist, anybody talking about it in the world today. And it's so important. It's such a game changer. We talked about what it could be. Now we can see what it often is. We're still talking about what it could be. but why is it such, how far have we come when it comes to, say, residential solar? Because as you talked to the CEO of Sunrun, she basically talked about they're not just a solar panel installing company. They're also now is selling a whole other product, which makes them more profitable and more competitive. And that is the battery itself. And
a couple of other projects. I mean, what's really interesting about that is they're moving from rooftop solar panels to what you might think of as sort of like a home electrification suite of products, which includes rooftop panels, batteries in your garage to store the power, a smart panel that sort of directs loads in a smart way that's responsive to price signals, an EV charger that talks to that smart panel and that talks to the rooftop solar. I mean, all this stuff is talking to itself. So, and they're even, they have a deal with Ford. So if you buy a Ford electric F-150, you can get a Sunrun package along with it. So they're trying to sort of move from just rooftop solar to home electrification more generally.
where are we at with the battery efficiency and affordability? And why don't I have, as I'm listening to your recent podcast, specifically this one about residential solar, and I'm always like an early adapter for moral reasons, which means I usually get screwed. I'm just so naive. But it also, what happens is, whether it's a software program, an app, or some new hardware like an EV or solar panels, I then get lapped by other people. In this case, I've got solar panels on my house, got them almost 10 years ago, but nobody's tried to sell me a battery, David. Like, really? I haven't done the research maybe, but a solar expert recently told me, a salesperson, like, why do you not have a battery? And I changed the subject because I was embarrassed for not understanding why this guy, don't have a battery yet. Why haven't I been sold one, sir?
Well, these markets, I mean, the rooftop solar market is one thing, but this broader home electrification market is still pretty underbaked. Like, it's still tentative. The technologies are just arriving, like figuring out how to package them, how to finance them, how to sell them, how to market them. It's all very much in process. The thing about the home battery is, do you have a problem with blackouts? Like, the main value proposition for the individual homeowner to have a battery is you can still have some power when the power goes out, right? That's because a lot of people don't know, if you just get solar panels and there's a blackout, the solar panels get blacked out too. You can't necessarily island off. And even if you can island off, you can only use what they're producing at the moment, which is not huge. So you need a battery to make that resilience part of it work. But if you're on a reliable grid, it's debatable whether you really need one or not. And even in that score, the home battery you would buy, like the battery in the F Ford 150 is like, I think 3, 4, 5 times bigger than that home battery. Like the batteries in these big SUVs are huge. So if your power went out, you can this is part of what Sunrun sells you with the Ford F-150 is a package that will do this. You can just plug your truck into your house, and your truck can run your whole house for probably like 2-3 days. It's
God,
wild.
That seems so fucking manly.
I know, right? I know. How tough is that?
You just imagine if like a smaller car ran your house, though. That would be not as manly.
Yeah, I mean, it's we can discuss whether we ought to be building EVs this friggin' big, but we are building them this big, which means the batteries are enormous. So even the resilience benefits, you can get some of that from your EV battery. So, this is the use case for home batteries is iffy. But as these markets develop, what's going to happen is, rather than just your house talking to the grid operator, the central grid, your house is going to start talking to other houses in your neighborhood. And so then your neighborhood, all of the houses and buildings in your neighborhood are going to start sharing power with one another
I'm surprised we haven't seen, and if you've covered this, and I'm sure you have, and I missed it, more kind of homeowners associations, more communities, more people working together to aggregate energy that they're creating on their roofs, et cetera. Do we have, like, are there things that individuals can do together with others in their community to try to create more energy that can be then shared?
Well, there's a couple of different aspects here. There are such thing as aggregators, which will sort of sign individual contracts with, whatever, 5,000 houses. And then they'll go to the utility and they'll basically, if you can aggregate and coordinate 5,000 houses, it's called a virtual power plant. You can make the aggregate act like a single big thing. And so then you can be involved in wholesale markets, right? You can sell power, you can sell capacity, you can sell those kind of things. Because even if you're only shaving like 2 or 3% from a given homeowner's battery, if you can shave 2 or 3% from 50,000 homeowners' batteries, you're reducing demand by a lot, and that's meaningful in grid terms. So we have those aggregators now that are operating in wholesale markets, and you can make a little extra income by signing up with those. But that's different than what I think you're getting at, which is sort of community resilience, community self-reliance, that kind of thing, where sort of you have community solar and then a grid, a sort of micro grid where you all live together and are sharing with one another. That is much more nascent, in part because it's just, we don't have a model for it, right? We're back to utilities, right? It's utilities don't favor that necessarily, and don't have a model for it.
The other thing that seemingly doesn't favor it is American culture. We hate sharing stuff. Like the rest of the world does better. I'll just say that at sharing things that everybody benefits from. I would rather not share with you. I don't like you.
I think if it ever really takes off at scale, it will be mostly automatic. Mostly it will be happening behind the scenes and you won't know.
Right.
You won't be bothered by it, right? Like if your water heater heats its water at in the middle of the night rather than in the middle of the day, you're not going to notice. Hot water is going to be there when you want it, right? So but it'll be aggregated behaviors like that are meaningful, but if things go well, homeowners largely won't even notice it's happening.
You mentioned electric vehicles a couple times. For the consumer electric vehicle, a whole nother pod, I suppose, on public transportation, because you certainly weren't saying that we shouldn't have big buses and trains electrified. We were talking more about individual vehicles like giant pickup trucks being electrified, and maybe the morality or practicality of that. But when it comes to the current market, David, where are we? And what do you say to the folks who are still criticizing EVs for all of that kind of hacky reasons, from they blow up and catch on fire to their, I don't know, whatever people say to criticize them? Obviously, they're still not affordable for most Americans. You finally just got yours. I think you got a Chevy. But the point is, most people aren't getting them still. I don't know where the market share is, but you seem to think, and a lot of analysts do, that this is completely inevitable, and entertaining the idea that it isn't is preposterous. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's fair to say. This is, I mean, I have worries all day long, but this is not one of them. I mean, I think I'll just put it this way, that I think we're past the tipping point globally and in the US, where the shift to EVs wholesale is inevitable on some time frame, right? Like we always, as with everything, we need to be going faster than we are, but we're on the bottom of that S curve where we're just starting to go up. So things are going to go faster and faster and faster and faster. You see this, a number of states now have policies where they're not going to allow gas or diesel cars to be sold in the state after 2030, like California, I think a bunch of others. You have states like Colorado, which are doubling EV subsidies. Even the federal EV subsidies are doubling it, and they are accelerating their uptake. The charging is still getting hashed out. It's still a little bit of a pain in the butt, but there's a big pot of gold at the end of that rainbow. So there's a lot of people competing, and that's going to work itself out. It's all going to work itself out. It's inevitable. And if you've ever driven an EV, like this is another reason why I'm confident about it, is like nobody who's driven an EV goes back, right? Like it's so much better. It's so much better, not just not visiting gas stations, but just the actual like minute by minute acceleration. Like I bought the lowest end EV that you can get, basically. Like my wife and I bought a used Chevy Bolt from 2018, right? So it's like the hatchback, 5 years old. And it is so zippy. It's like the zippiest car I've ever driven. I hate cars. I hate driving. And I love driving it because it's just like, it's like a video game. It's so much more fun than any gas car I've ever driven.
I'm on my second. I still have the old one, 2 Chevy Volts. And
the late lamented Volt.
Yeah, so sad. But I noticed that right away. And now obviously the higher end ones are that much more zippy to use. It's about propulsion. I think propulsion is super manly too, by the way.
Yes, I test drove the Mustang Mach, whatever they're calling it. And my wife and I agreed, it's genuinely unsettling how fast you can go off the line. My first thought was like, I don't want ordinary people in charge of this kind of power. Like, this is ludicrous. I mean, I can't even imagine what like your high-end Teslas or whatever. Like at a certain point, you're just like, it's a hat on a hat. Like you're going faster than you ever will need to go on a normal street. So I'd like to see those cars start to get scaled down.
What are the remaining obstacles, do you think, to wider adaptation?
It's charging infrastructure is almost charging infrastructure. And this is maddening, and I don't have a great explanation for it, is why U.S. automakers are so obsessed with making large luxury EVs. Why the little nascent little market for EVs in the U.S. is dominated by these giant tanks that cost $60,000 to $80,000 or whatever. Who's gonna make the little city car? Who's gonna make the cheap little, like the equivalent of the VW Bug for the EV era, right? Who's going to make the little $10,000 city car? And it's starting to look like Chinese automakers are getting really good at those, and they're going to come over and start eating our lunch if the US automakers don't get a clue. But that's another barrier right now, is just that most of the EVs are high end. So there's a whole part of the market that's not being served. The market will figure that out too.
Well, that's what I would think the answer is the market, the American market. Europeans and I guess Asians are used to smaller cars because they don't subsidize gas, so they have to pay more, and you're not going to get a giant car. They also don't usually drive as far, I guess, it would be the answers. But in America, the American automobile manufacturers must have all of the data. And I'm sure, one thing is, I keep making the jokes about masculinity. There's a little bit of that, like people like weird insecurities, but there's also like a lot of people that want to that have kids that want to drive these giant cars because they're safer for them. They're not safer for anybody else, but they're safer for people driving them. So is it just that we're afraid to get into small cars and they're not cool?
I don't know. I'm naturally suspicious of the sort of culture argument. I think that what happens is large economic forces shape our desires, and then we're like, oh, look at what we just naturally desire. Like Americans just naturally desire bigger cars. It was like, well, they sold bigger and bigger cars and made the bigger cars cooler and marketed them more and phased out their lower end cars. And so everybody went along with that. And now they're like, oh, it's because we wanted it. Well, I was like, maybe, but I bet, I bet they could manipulate us into wanting something else if they wanted to, like this idea that there's something inherent in Americans that wants big cars is goofy to me. Like, I can understand wanting a big car when all the other cars are big, just because you're terrified to go out in a small car. That makes sense to me. But like, there's nothing funnier than being in like a big city, driving these narrow streets and watching these yahoos, pencil dicks with their giant SUVs trying to maneuver on these little streets. I'm just like, what are you getting out of this? What is this? It's gotten to the point of like self-parody now. And it's worth saying, I mean, I get yelled at if I don't make this point, that EVs still wear down the roads. Their tires still shed particulates, which are unhealthy to breathe. They still make noise. They still take up space. They're still bad for all the reasons cars are bad, right? They're not solving all the car problems. They're only solving one of the car problems, which is CO2. But all the other problems with cars are still problems.
You didn't mention the one that most critics of EVs go to, which is the battery itself and the sustainability of
the
disposing.
materials. That's so goofy. Like,
but the only thing I just want to just rephrase it in what you're about to say here is, so often people will criticize all kinds of new technologies, and I will just concede. I'm like, all of your criticisms are fine. Let's concede. Let's say they're all accurate. It's still far better for every reason. But people, that's not how we argue. It's certainly not how we communicate. What about the batteries? You're so Mr. Anti-pollution. What about those batteries? I'm like, I get it. A new car, no matter how its energy sources, is always bad, worse than, but it's still, how do you talk about that? I think I've asked you that before.
Yeah,
but
I mean, it's such a simple point, and so it's hard to hear these kind of things.
Yes,
as offered in good faith, because,
right.
but there is to a certain extent, humans, I think, what is ubiquitous and familiar becomes invisible, right? So the fact that driving around in gas cars is an ongoing day-to-day catastrophe for the environment just becomes invisible to us because it's so familiar, right? But here's the thing. When you dig up materials to make a battery, you dig them up once, and then you have a battery for 20, 30, 40 years. You dig up fossil fuels to drive your car for a day, then the next day, you got to dig up more fossil fuels to drive the car, and more fossil fuels the next day, right? You're digging up fossil fuels continuously. So the scale of damage done by fossil fuel cars dwarfs even the most pessimistic conceivable estimate of the material demands of EVs. I mean, I think that's obvious. It's been made, the point's been made in a bunch of different articles now with a bunch of different visuals, just like dwarfs. They're a different scale. So that's the first point, is just anything that moves away from the daily combustion of fossil fuels is good, almost by definition, no matter what it is. That's the first point. The second point is, yes, these things do damage. Yes, copper does damage, right? Like lithium is nasty to mine. Yes, these are real problems, and not just environmental problems, but social problems. Like, these mining is done under horrendous conditions in many cases. So we should be pushing for regulations that try to start a race to the top. Here, we should try to get demand pull for better, more sustainably gathered materials, and above and beyond all else, we should try to minimize the number of cars we need, right? We should try to minimize the amount we drive by building better public transit and better walking and biking infrastructure and better density, right? Like, let's minimize the amount of driving, period. That will serve every conceivable environmental and social goal.
Have you written or talked? I'm sure you have, but I haven't seen it, and I'm not sure. Maybe it's because I don't know how big of a deal it is or how much of an impact it is. But there are now electric bikes in every community I go to in America, and then scooters, which, I judge anybody driving a scooter because I'm so super masculine about things. Yet I have ridden them, and
They're so fun.
I find them awesome.
Fun.
but I usually am wearing like a football jersey and like something manly because I wouldn't just
carrying a big chunk of meat or something, like
yeah,
a
I
big
usually have like a tool belt, a chunk of meat, and ironically, I'm wearing jean shorts where the white pocket is just slipping out the under of the hem. But that's just my style. Anyway, where do you talk or think much about the bikes and the scooters and all that?
I think that e-bikes are such a dark horse. I think they're huge and under-discussed, underappreciated.
Okay.
They are a miracle technology. Like, it's another thing. Like, if you talk to anybody who has started riding one, right, their eyes light up. Like, there's no going back. It's amazing. It's such an amazing feeling. It's like all the good parts of biking. And if you don't want any of the effort or sweat or any of that part, you can eliminate all that. You can just have all the good parts of biking. And so you can get your groceries. You can do practical things. You can carry kids around. You can tow your kids around. You can tow your groceries around. It's not going to, it's all electric propulsion doing it for you. So it's like, it is the perfect car killer. Like it, or I would even more specifically, it's the perfect second car killer, right? Rather than getting a second car, get an e-bike and your life will improve so much. You will be so happy. You'll be so glad you did. And I think e-bikes are going to be like, they are the single most energy efficient form of propulsion, I think, in the universe, literally. So they're just like environmentally a win, socially a win. They're fun. They're good for.
Who's adapted them to them the best? I rode one, by the way. The one thing you didn't mention is that we're at an inflection point, at least, and maybe for a while, that people don't know about them. So when you ride up a hill, seemingly effortlessly, people think you're awesome. When I was in Australia, I was in what was that, Bondi Beach, and I had like 2 beers, and I was like, I'll just ride the bike back to the train. It'll be easy because it's only 2 miles. I didn't know because Google Maps doesn't show the gradient, and no one told me that Sydney was fucking San Francisco hill-wise. Yeah. And so there I am riding like half in the bag up a very steep hill to get to the train station. But I did it only
breezy as you please, just like no problem. Exactly. It is the feeling of going up a hill effortlessly on a bike.
Yeah.
There is literally nothing like that in the universe.
So weird.
It's hard to capture. It is the best feeling.
So who's doing it? Is anybody really like adapted a city or a country that they're like really a big market? I almost feel like somewhere like the Netherlands or something. But
it's all the usual suspects, right?
Yeah,
all the cities that are doing cool urbanism stuff are doing this too. I mean, it's interesting. One of the interesting things that's happening is it's one thing if you have cars that are fast and pedestrians that are slow, right? You have the sidewalk and the road. But what's happening is we're getting all these intermediate forms of travel with their own speeds, right? Like you have normal bikes, you have e-scooters, you have e-bikes, you have these like electric mopeds now, all of which are sort of slightly a different speed and a different sort of safety level. So there's a lot of puzzling out to do of how to build infrastructure that accommodates them all without them clashing with one another. All that's going on outside of the US. Like no one in the US is doing anything particularly well on that score, but like the cities that care about these kind of things are really running into interesting infrastructure sort of puzzles, like how to solve that puzzle.
Well, you mentioned the one actual real dilemma that needs, it's obviously doable, is charging stations for EVs. And I definitely want to talk with you about as it's called, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is, you say Democrats message badly. I think they've gotten a lot better. They certainly do, but they've gotten better in that the IRA is really a huge climate bill. Talk a little bit about what it does, especially to address manufacture in America of things like batteries and solar panels, as well as charging stations, because it does so much that even the most passionate and cynical activists who I've followed, read, and interviewed, and like to count myself one as, are pretty excited about it.
I mean, if you understand the energy system and you understand IRA, you cannot not be impressed. You cannot dismiss the significance of it. It is enormous. It is an enormous thing. And it's so, I mean, there's so much to say about it on so many levels, political, social, whatever, what have you. But basically, at its root, it is the United States government dumping large amounts of money on the entire clean energy ecosystem. So not just wind and solar anymore, but dumping money on, hydrogen, long duration energy storage, e-bikes, chargers, like just name it. So it's a bunch of money to incentivize demand for these technologies. And then the other major aspect of it is almost all of the incentives are sort of broken up so that you get more if you use domestic material, right? You get the full incentive if you use domestic material. So there's an enormous financial incentive to do what's called onshoring or friendshoring of the manufacturing of these things. And so in the year since IRA has passed, I think there's been something like $220-ish billion of new investment in battery and EV manufacturing in the US. It is like everybody kept saying globalism, globalism, globalism. These parts of the country have been hollowed out by globalism. We moved all our heavy manufacturing overseas. We've been lamenting this for decades. Joe Biden and the Democrats are coordinating a massive reshoring of our manufacturing capacity, a manufacturing renaissance of enormous scale under our noses, and getting virtually no friggin' political credit at all for it. It's surreal.
Well, that's media for you, but I think to say that the shortest way. But it sounds like you're saying is that Biden and Democrats are America firsters.
Yes, I mean that's this. Some of it was political necessity, like Manchin. As everyone knows at this point, Joe Manchin, West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, was the kind of the needle through which this camel had to pass. I forget what the analogy is. He was the final sort of like only what he would approve of could go. And his whole incentive was this aspect of it, trying to bring these. He doesn't want to shift because right now China dominates the supply chain for almost all of these technologies, EVs, batteries, raw materials. I mean, you name it. While we spent the last decade faffing about with austerity, they spent the last decade investing in their capacity. And now they're way ahead of us. And so Joe Manchin doesn't want to just switch to clean technologies under those circumstances, because then we would just be switching from dependent on this and that country for our oil and gas to dependent on China for our batteries and materials. So part of what he wanted is big incentives to reshore these things. And so it's happening. And another interesting political aspect of it is most of this, the majority, I think 60 to 70% of this investment is pouring into red states, is pouring into Southern and Midwestern states. And so again, we have a political experiment like, these are the states that are literally complaining about the lack of manufacturing, right? That's literally what they say their problem is. That's why they say they've turned against Democrats, right?
Well,
Here's a bunch of manufacturing. Will it make a political difference at all?
Well, to some extent, it definitely is, right? People lose their job. We don't often blame the right reasons, causes. People don't understand trade policy or tax policy. They just get a message and they get it, I mean, some people...
Well, they blame whoever is president, which is dumb, in a lot of ways,
but you're talking about this investment, especially even in these red states. And it's just that is it not being messaged well enough? Or is it, as I often kind of think, that no matter how well Democrats or the people who win off of these technologies or manufacturing plants or whatever it is, they always just get so easily demonized by your local or your popular right-wing radio guy. I mean, it's hard to beat that.
I go back and forth between those two. On the one hand, I wish that the Democrats would think more and spend more on storytelling to go alongside these policies. Because just like I say over and over again, the factory opening up down the street and employing your cousin doesn't necessarily mean anything to you unless someone tells you what it means, right? Someone has to be there with the story. This is part of a national trend. Like, this is a national thing we're doing on purpose. We're bringing manufacturing back on purpose. That's what you are seeing. Someone's got to tell that story. So we're not doing that well enough. But on the other hand, as you say, Biden can go give a dozen speeches, can go to a dozen ribbon cuttings, can go do everything he can do. Democrats can do everything they can do to tell this story, but they can't make the media cover it. They can't make Fox cover it. They can't make right-wing radio guy cover it. Like, the information environment is so degraded that there is, in some sense, a limited things Democrats can do to get messages out.
I don't know why no one ever listens to my amazing ideas, but I just feel like all these projects, as they're built, should be painted blue. Just paint the building fucking battery building blue and be like, blue brought this to you. But the truth is,
blue project.
The most insidious thing that happens, really, the most enraging, it happened in my town, is that the Republicans in my town came and presented a giant check to the first responder, the ambulance corps in my town, with their smiles. They voted against it, but they presented the check a month before the election, and it made me very crazy. It made me very upset.
Believe me, all the Republican senators and governors and whatever are attending these ribbon cuttings for these factories, these EV factories and these battery factories. They're happy to come and celebrate and say, look at this great thing we did. So in a sense, I think you're right. The Democrats need to be sort of blunter and in a sense cruder and more obvious and more sort of banging the table about this than they are. But also, the media is so broken. There's just it's hard to know what to do to reach people anymore. People are so insulated in their bubbles. I mean, it's not just trying to reach Republicans to tell them this is happening. Like, right now, as we're speaking, we're seeing the sort of online left losing its friggin' mind and immediately reverting to this sort of, there's no difference between Biden and Trump. It doesn't matter who you elect, blah, blah. All this rhetoric is back. And I'm just like, I want to pull my hair out. Like, Biden has done so much that most people just don't ever hear about. They just don't know.
Do you find that mostly as a result of what's going on with the Arab-Israeli conflict, or is it?
Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm talking about. But Biden's got no store of goodwill among these people, because they just don't people will say to pollsters, like, my big thing is climate change, and I'm mad Biden hasn't done anything except for open up the Willow oil field, right? Like, somehow that's the only thing they've heard about. They haven't heard about the historic multi-$100 billion investments that are pouring in. No one told them.
My 18-year-old daughter, freshman in college, we were just talking about it, and she's like, I'm just so disappointed that he greenlit the Willow project. I'm like,
somehow they all heard about that. Somehow that got to them instantly, but the trillions of dollars he's spending on green technology somehow has not made it to them. And I don't know who in the chain is responsible for that, but
it's fucking, I swear to God, David, I think it's literally TikTok. It's young people get their news from TikTok. It was fascinating to see my daughters responding to what happened in Israel and Gaza. Fascinating, because they'd never seen news of the conflict. Right. Yeah. And so they saw it and they fell into whatever meme made them feel. And I said, I said to them, I go, guys, it looks horrible what happened in Israel. It is horrible what happened in Israel. But I promise you, everything is about to swing, because it always happens this way. Israel then goes and blasts the shit out of Palestinians. You'll see. And my daughter goes, Dad, you are right, because TikTok then changed. But I do feel like that's where they get a lot of their information. And speaking of which, young people, activists, you had this awesome conversation with this really amazing human being named Jeff Ordauer, who has been an organizer for 30 years with the labor movement, with the queer movement, and now he is director of North America 350.org, which is probably the preeminent activist organization, I think, founded by Bill McKibben, but obviously a lot of amazing people in that amongst others. And you guys had this, everybody needs to go listen to that conversation for a lot of reasons, but there's this idea that I never heard that you guys were talking about, that you guys, I guess, presented. Liberal activists, climate activists have been so focused on preventing fossil fuel production, and that we're so good at blocking things. That's been our strategy. But what we really need to shift is to building things, and that's not our natural place to be. And when you guys talked about that and identified that, I go, that is a long and thoughtful conversation, and you had one. So tell me a little bit more about that and what you learned from him about the movement, the climate movement.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of a broader kind of, I don't know what to call movement quite yet, but this idea of, well, I'll just start here. If you want to switch from fossil fuel energy to clean energy, even if you just want to replace the existing fossil fuel energy with clean energy, you need to start now building thousands of wind turbines and solar panels and batteries, et cetera, et cetera. Like, there's no way to decarbonize the economy without building a buttload of stuff. And that means new transmission lines, new solar fields, new, more dense housing, new public transportation, all this stuff. And what's happened is the left has gotten very, very adept over the last few decades of blocking the sort of worst egregious stuff from industry. So they're very elaborate ecosystem of activist tropes, of laws and regulations and lawsuits and law, generally law, they have these whole organizations devoted to just lawyering, most of which is just about suing people and blocking stuff. And so they've gotten really good at blocking things, but this machinery of blocking is now being used to block good stuff. It's now being used to block clean energy. You have the same, sort of environmental protection laws being used to block wind turbines and solar panels and stuff like that. And you just
don't progressive activists, by climate activists.
Well, by climate activists, yes. I mean, it's debatable. Environmentalists, it's debatable actually exactly what these groups consist of. Like, most professional climate activists will tell you, yes, we know we need to build a lot of stuff, but sort of like the old school grassroots environmental movement is still very much in blocking stuff mode. Yeah. But it's not just activists. It's the law. It's communities. It's NIMBYs. Like, the whole country needs to shift into a building things mode. And this is what, like, if you ever listen to Ezra Klein, he talks about the liberalism of abundance. There's this sort of like movement among liberals in general to shift away from this sort of scolding talk about less and the evils of excess and all this, and more just, let's do good things. Let's build good things. Let's build a prosperous, high-tech future that we can all enjoy. But to do that, we've got to turn to building. So that's going to be difficult for everyone, but it's going to be difficult for the environmental movement to really think its way around that. And that's what Ordoer is trying to chew his way through, is how do we do activism in favor of building things, right? Like, how do you rally to build something, and how do you get people fired up? Because it's very easy to get people fired up over evil company coming to abuse you by doing this, right? That's very easy. How do you get people fired up over the possibility of building a good thing? Because, among other things, that good thing is going to be built by a company that's going to make money off it, right? So there you're suddenly doing activism in favor of a corporation, which is, feels weird. So just how to work all that out. I mean, I think what they've settled on, I think, mostly is activism against utilities for blocking stuff, right? So sort of demonize the utilities for blocking stuff, demonize the utilities, then you got your bad guy, right? But the whole point of demonizing them is saying, get out of the way, let this stuff happen, stop slowing and impeding these things. And that's, we'll see how it'll work. It's a really interesting socio-cultural shift happening beneath our feet, if nothing else.
I'll let you go, man. But before I do, why don't you tell me what one of your favorite podcasts or issues or even places you've been to? Australia, you've been to Iceland this year.
Two great trips this year. To two really quirky. I mean, I didn't really plan it this way. They both sort of fell in my lap, but two really quirky island nations with very quirky, idiosyncratic energy systems that were just fascinating, Australia and Iceland. So I recommend anybody go there or read my stuff about them. But I will say my favorite pod that I've done recently is one I just recorded and have not released yet. But you've probably heard, everyone who thinks about this stuff at all has heard, the sun is not always shining and the wind is not always blowing. So how can we run an energy system on wind and solar when they come and go out of our control, right? Like, are we just supposed to shiver in the dark when the sun is down? All this, I'm sure you've heard.
Yeah, of course.
Variations of this. Forever. So I just did a podcast. I just recorded it with Jesse Jenkins, the Princeton professor, modeler, energy guru guy, where we just tackle this subject head on. Variability, wind and solar variability. What is it? What are the implications? How do we solve it? Do we have the technology to solve it? How are we going to solve it? On what time horizon are we going to solve it? Should we worry about it? Is it a barrier to decarbonizing? We just really tackle it once and for all, this question about intermittency, about variability of renewable energy. And so, because I have that coming at me all the time, and there are scraps of answers here and there are things you can say, but this will finally be one link I can just send people and say, just listen.
I can't wait.
Take an hour and a half, listen to this, and you will know everything you need to know about intermittency and whether it matters.
It is true of all of your podcasts, and you do such great work getting the right people, asking the right questions, getting right to the points. I learn so much from your work. You're doing the best, most important, in my opinion. What do I mean? But still, I'm really loving it and love supporting it. Volts.WTF. David Roberts, such a great pleasure catching up with you and talking about things a little bit different than certainly what we've been inundated by for the past few weeks. So
true. Thanks so much, Pete. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Hitting